Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. I'm saying good evening, I guess, mainly for Professor Daly. Welcome to all of you for joining this discussion on unlocking the... Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. I'm saying good evening, I guess, mainly for Professor Daly. Welcome to all of you for joining this discussion on unlocking the power of nature financing, which is hosted by the World Economic Forum. My name is Ma Jun. I chair the Green Finance Committee of China Society for Finance and Banking, and I'm deeply involved in a number of international green finance initiatives, including co-chairing the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group and co-chairing the Joint Study Group on Biodiversity launched by NGFS, namely the Central Banks and Supervisor Network for Greening the Financial System, in collaboration with a research network called INSPIRE. It's my great honor and pleasure to moderate this session today. Based on some of the biodiversity-related studies by the NGFS, we have come to the following conclusions. Number one, human activities have led to a rapid decline in biodiversity and the functioning of the ecosystem in general. Number two, biodiversity loss could result in serious negative impacts on economy and financial stability, as so much economic activities are dependent on nature and biodiversity. And number three, central banks, financial regulators, and financial services in general need to take actions to address nature-related risks, including by mobilizing more private capital to participate in nature-positive investments and to prevent investments from harming nature and biodiversity while introducing proper risk management practices. Many countries have begun to take actions. For example, in China, the most recent 5-year plan allocates 880 billion RMB to fund the ecological protection and restoration, while also encouraging diversified investment mechanisms from the private sector and civil society to enhance these efforts. Our discussion today is going to focus on the topic of how to mobilize more financing to invest in nature. So I'm very glad that we have 4 distinguished panelists today for this discussion. They are Madam Inger Anderson, Executive Director from United Nations Environmental Program. And we have Professor Ouyang Zhiyun, who is the Director General of Research Center for Eco-Environmental Science under Chinese Academy of Science. And we have Mr. Frederick To, who is Chief Executive Officer from Gen Zero, Singapore. I was just told that Frederick moved from Temasek to this new company. And we also have Professor Gretchen Daly, being Professor in Environmental Science from Stanford University. And it's her 11 p.m. now. And we also have Ging Hui, who is the Managing Director from the World Economic Forum, and she will be giving us some closing remarks when we finish our conversation in the next 40 minutes or so. So without further ado, now let me kick off the first round of discussion by asking each panelist one question. I hope you can answer the first set of questions in 3 or 4 minutes time. Then we can go to the second round, depending on availability of time. So my first question goes to Madam Anderson. What is the global momentum of investing in nature to prevent biodiversity loss and combat climate crisis, and what role financing can play? Madam Anderson, please.
Thank you, and greetings to everyone from Nairobi. And let me just greet you, Mr. Ma Jun, because you've really been a mover and a shaker in this space. And we at UNEP are very grateful and very impressed with that leadership, as indeed all the distinguished panelists have been present and vocal in this space. Look, we know that global financing for biodiversity is estimated right now around 80 to 90 billion annually. And we also know that's far below where the hundreds of billions of dollars where we need to be. What we also are seeing, that most of that money is coming from the public investment side. Well, that's nice, no objection here, but it's also clear that these large investments that are needed to ensure that nature can reproduce itself, to ensure that nature can give us what we need in terms of our pollination, in terms of air and water and food and enjoyment in nature, etc. Well, then we have to have much greater investments. But so we need to see significant investment. Now, at the same time, on the public side, we have a lot of subsidies that go into agriculture, forestry, and fisheries. We saw the recent WTO agreement, which was very good, although it has a lot of loopholes still, but nevertheless, dealing with some fishery subsidies. But nevertheless, we need to find ways of ensuring that we have much smarter business investments. And so what does that look like? Because whereas, and what we saw in the opening video, it was all hardware, right? It was all infrastructure investment, smart and great and green. But that's not what it will take to invest in nature, because each of these infrastructure investments, smart and great and green, can have an ecological footprint. And so the thing is, how is it that we are going to feed the world equitably, and that we are going to ensure, nevertheless, that we leave aside in nature a sufficient amount of intact ecosystem, biodiversity, and genetic diversity, that actually nature can continue to replicate itself and to give back to us? So in a sense, when we look at the G20 investments in what we are calling nature-based solutions, well, that needs to reach around 285 billion per year by 2050. And we are so very, very far from that at this time. But when we think, of course, and we all know these numbers, right? We spent 14 trillion just in a couple of years on COVID. We found that money. And I often say that, well, if trees would give us cell phone signals, we will all plant trees. Too bad that they only give us the air we breathe, right? But there isn't that understanding. So we also need to really be clear in terms of how we regulate around this. This cannot be driven alone by the private sector. So I really look forward to hearing the comments from the other panelists to see how some of the private sector engagements, with which you also engage, can truly step up. So let me draw it to a close here. Mr. Majun, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Anderson. I think the number just tells how daunting the task is. Currently, as you said, it's 80 or 90 billion US dollar being put into nature and biodiversity, but we need probably 10 times of that amount. And really public sector, private sector partnership, I think, will be the key in utilizing some of the fiscal and other regulatory resource to mobilize and catalyze private sector participation. So let's move on to China. My question goes to Professor Ouyang Zhiyun. I've been working with Professor Ouyang on a number of projects in Inner Mongolia, planting trees in desert recently. Learned a lot from him. But my question for Professor Ouyang is, how is China fighting this nature and climate battle, and especially how China's policy making encourage private sector participation in protecting nature and financing nature positive projects?
Oh, I will speak Chinese, okay?
Yes, please. We have translation, so no worry.
Oh, that's great. Okay. 非常高兴，非常荣幸来参加这个会议，也非常感谢主持人马军教授。其实我从3个方面吧谈谈对中国的这方面的一些考虑。首先对国家宏观层面来讲，中国政府一定要生态系统服务和生物多样性作为国家发展战略的中国重大政策制定一个重要的依据。像对国家区域发展战略的层面，中国把国土分为三大类区域吧。一类是城市化区域，叫做支撑工业化城市建设，叫做城市化区，我们叫优化开发区和重点开发区。第二类的方面呢，就是农产品主产区，就是耕地分布区，保证粮食安全。第三类重点生态空间区，就是保障生态系统产品和生态服务的供给，就是基于水涵养、土壤保持、伐木枯杀、生态保护的要求而建设的。 这是第二个层面的土地管理层面中国划定了生态保护红线，占国土面积30%以下，主要是要保障优质生态产品、生态服务的供给。这个山端性和自然遗产保护方面，中国已经启动了重构中国自然保护的体系，包括国家公园、自然保护区、自然公园、种子自然保护区等等，还建立新的国家公园。中国政府和中国的习近平主席宣布，中国要建立全球最大规模的国家公园体系。所以这些的国家宏观层面的一些政策，为经济为企业或者是国家的对生态保护的投入奠定了一个政策的基础。第二个方面呢，中国为了保护或促进生态保护修复这方面，启动了一系列的生态保护修复工程，就是基于大量的投入，像咱们说的天然保护工程、特别环境环草工程、区域生态保护修复工程，像山间园的保护、经济风采园的保护、摆放生态安全品质保护等等。去年中国也宣布了建立重要生态系统保护修复重大工程规划，以及到2021年到2035年，对中国分离7个区域，包括黄河流域、长江流域、海岸带的保护建设，这都是以基于自然解决方案，对防护灾害、增加固碳、提供生态系统服务方面做出的规律布局。为了保障这些政策落实，中国第三个方面就是经济建设方面也做了非常大的投入和努力。像咱们知道的生态转移支付，到2020年，国家就投资800多亿，就用于支持重点生态区的县的生态保护修复，为公共产品、社会公共产品的提供，这方面，同时还有生态供应链补偿、湿地补偿、保护地补偿等等，这是国家政府的投入来进行的。当然还有横向补偿，像北京和河北等等，还有广东和新郑等广东和香港方面，对一些地区之间通过生态产品和服务的交流和消费和使用给予补偿，这也是这方面在用于政府的一些方面的努力。但我们现在非常高兴的看到，中国开始启动了生态产品价值实现机制的试点，像对丽水、对福州等等，通过核算生态系统服务和自然资本的价值，来鼓励企业或者政府参与生态进行建立探索新的经营机制和经营体制，像生态银行的建立、生态资产的交易等等，这些方面都是鼓励企业和社会资本的参与，将生态价值转回经济效益。对今后这个方面，我感觉就保护生态方面会全面提升生态资产方面的工作，加上生态资产的管理，这当然最重要的会推动生态资产产权的明细化，还有生态资产的经营权和效益权的转化，为经营自主或者生态金融提供重要的基础。第二个呢，还会全面推进生态产品价值的试点，这个就是通过新的经济政策、新的经营机制来鼓励生态产品转化经济效益，这是我的一些了解和理解。谢谢。当然，我们这方面，特别是经营机制对环境保护领域的作用，我们马青先生是对这方面的最大的专家了，他会做细致介绍。我就讲的生态方面一些工作，向大家做个简单的汇报。谢谢。
谢谢欧阳教授。Professor Ouyang said at the macro level, we need policy to really specify what are the protected areas. For example, we're aiming to protect 30% of the area, including using national park and so on. That's key. And also the fiscal transfer mechanism to areas where they need the money is important. Plus what they call horizontal transfer. Some of the cities which actually consume the ecosystem value needs to pay for those areas that are producing the eco valuation. And the GEP is now being applied to quite a few places, try to build a basis for some asset transfer or asset trading for the purpose of protecting nature and biodiversity. Now, let me move on to Professor Daly, in the global landscape, what are the best practices of public-private sector collaboration and mechanism for encouraging private sector investment in nature and getting benefited from it?
Thank you so much for leading this. And I want to acknowledge, first off, how well put Dr. Inger Anderson's alarm with respect to the financing gap is, and what how severe the consequences will, how severely they will build of failing to fill that gap. And then turning to Professor Ouyang, the ambition and the innovation and successes that are being driven through China are really an inspiration for the whole world. And it's very heartening to have your presentation here. And I'll, from my perspective, having worked many years in China and also in many other regions of the world, say that looking globally, what's being advanced is an approach that's systematic and that can be applied globally with local tailoring to the most urgent needs, the social, political, economic context. And these investments that are needed, strategic investments, would aim to achieve highest returns for obviously climate security and nature positive, nature regenerative growth. And we see these really being led in a very inspiring way by the multilateral development banks now. The Inter-American Development Bank stands out with support from President Macron in launching several years ago a natural capital lab that's meant to integrate throughout all bank operations the kinds of approaches that Professor Ouyang was just detailing to, first of all, define where and how much to protect, how to secure, second, nature, climate, and livelihoods, and third, how to track progress. And this is being done across Latin America, and most recently, the Asian Development Bank also launched a natural capital lab, stepping up as well to mainstream these systematic approaches for integrating nature into achieving climate security, water security, coastal resilience, livable, sustainable cities, securing food, water, energy, health, and tracking progress in doing so. And we're seeing now this vision expanding well beyond even these regions of Latin America and Asia, with countries worldwide reaching for development plans that use science and technology to help define where the highest payoff would be in making these investments. But then getting back to what we need, there's an enormous gap still in capacity to deploy these kinds of approaches that Ouyang mentioned and that are being really pioneered in many other regions by many other countries. There's still an enormous gap. The Global Environment Facility is mobilizing to help close that gap when it comes to capacity in just the knowledge to implement these approaches, whether it's the science, the tools, the policy and finance mechanisms that Mr. Ma Jr. alluding to and Ouyang as well, and also helping to really activate investment on the part of other public sector actors, but then most vitally, private sector partners. And this, I'll close in just saying, really lags behind. There are a number of opportunities now where the multilateral development banks and other public sector entities have, beautiful projects that are government developed and approved and ready to go. that meet all of the criteria for high return on investment, but they need much more private sector financing to deliver on their promise. And I thank you for this conversation to help activate investment along those lines. And back to you, Mr. Majun.
Thank you very much, Professor Daly. You mentioned the role of MDB. I think it's very important because many of these nature-related projects are relatively new, and the private sector typically are fairly worried about all the risks that's associated with these new type of projects, and whether they're policy risk or business risk or currency risk or whatever. And the MDBs can overcome these problems by providing demonstration projects and showing them these are durable, and part of that could make money. And we can also provide maybe low-cost funding to help private sector to be involved. So actually, I'm asking Mrs. Anderson in the second round this question, what MDBs can do, maybe in collaboration with UNEP in creating some of the demonstration projects on nature-related financing so that it can be scaled later with more MDBs and with local finance. I'm going to come back to you after I ask Frederick the question in the first round on that. So Frederick, in the coming years, what are the new business models and opportunities for financing nature and biodiversity, given that you have been with financial institutions and now with company? So I guess your perspective will be very interesting.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Ma. And thanks again to our colleagues at the forum for the kind invitation to speak with you and to join such a distinguished panel. I think it's a very interesting question around the financing and investment opportunities within nature. But I think I would start, first of all, by talking about the importance of addressing climate change and understanding that actually protecting our natural environment is part and parcel of the work that we need to do in order to be able to contribute positively to tackling the challenges of climate change and decarbonization. So as Dr. Ma mentioned, I was until recently part of the Sustainable Solutions team at Temasek. And starting in July, I joined to lead the new investment company wholly owned by Temasek that focuses on investing into decarbonization solutions. And we split our work into three parts. The first part is really investing into technology-based solutions that will address decarbonization. The second part into nature-based solutions, and the third part into what we call carbon ecosystem enablers. Now, I think the one point to make when we think about investing into nature is to understand that investments and opportunities into nature really is part and parcel of a broader suite of solutions that we need in order to be able to protect the planet. So we shouldn't see nature as something that is discrete from, say, technology solutions. They're all part and parcel of the same thing. The second part that I would say really is that it is important to look at nature because in the nearer term, nature offers opportunities that are perhaps a little bit more cost-effective in order to be able to address the challenges of decarbonization and climate change. Take, for example, the fact that today we need to probably pay something like $800 to $1,000 per ton in order to be able to realize direct air capture solutions, right? And you would have heard of some of these opportunities out in the market. Well, nature has given us direct air capture capability, and that's in the form of trees. So, and they can achieve it at a much lower price point today. Now, of course, there are challenges: measurability, permanence, additionality. These are many of the criteria set that we will need to consider, but I think equally important to feature them. Now, finally, I would also make a point that nature in and of itself offers us from the business community three separate things. One, in and of itself, there is value to protect diversity and nature. Two, natural ecosystems actually afford us a new and different way to think about materials, solutions that we can draw on in a more regenerative way, as Dr. Daly had mentioned. And finally, nature opportunities actually give us a new way of being able to catalyze and accelerate the growth of carbon markets to be able to allow us to, in the near term, actually think of ways to be able to mitigate climate change and to be able to price carbon more sensibly for corporates to actually adopt. So in this way, I think the opportunities within nature is strong. And I will probably end off by saying that in a recent report that we did together with the forum, they have actually identified up to about over $4 trillion worth of economic opportunities from investing into nature and biodiversity. Now, even if you were to take a little bit of a haircut around that number, there are many, many zeros behind this. And the size of the opportunity is tremendous, and it could also lead to many other new jobs. So I think in the coming round, Dr. Ma, maybe we can expand on some of these things as to what it would take for us to be able to fully take advantage of many of the opportunities that exist within nature. But suffice to say, it is an important part of climate change action. It is not really either or when it comes to nature versus technology. We need to think about a whole suite of portfolio solutions. It is cost-effective, near-term ready today, and that finally the size of the opportunity is tremendous. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frederick. Now, I think from the financial sector perspective, which I worked for 20 plus years, the typical complaint is that nature and biodiversity are great, but investing in these projects are not making me money. That's a very, very typical reaction. It's a bankability issue, and that's why I think 90% of the financing supposed to come from private sector is not yet mobilized. But there's so many different reasons why they have this perception. Maybe there's not enough incentives. For example, Frederick, you just mentioned the carbon market is not functioning so well to award those projects that are planting trees and growing grass and so on. And maybe there are too many perceived risks, which these companies don't know how to overcome and have not seen good examples. And that's where I brought in this demonstration project by MDBs as important. And maybe the funding cost is too high. If you borrow from a commercial bank at a commercial rate, and indeed these projects are not making money, so you need some subsidies and government funding and so on. And maybe the duration is not right, because a lot of nature-based solutions take a long time to yield result, rather than making you money within 1 year, 2 years. And the funding should come with longer durations than what they are right now. So these are the type of issues I think I hope to get some answer in the second round. Maybe I'll kick off with Mrs. Anderson. Hope you can have some perspective, especially from UNEP and the MDBs.
Thank you, and thanks. Very interesting interventions by my fellow panelists. Thank you so much. Look, there are no simple solutions, so we can't wish this away. We have to start there, right? You framed it very, very well. The financial world looks for shorter term profit, but you plant the tree today and your grandchildren will sit under its shade. So we need to understand that the time horizon which we deploy does not yield itself to that quick turnaround. That's just the reality. And the reality is also that as long as the system's boundaries for our investments, we are allowed to, by the financial system and by the regulatory settings, to call nature and impacts on the nature to a large extent an externality that doesn't have a cost. As long as that is the case, well then, yes, it's quicker to cut the proverbial forest down and have timber than it is to grow the trees and have my grandchildren enjoy whatever it is enjoyment they would bring. So the systemic issues will not work. Now, I agree with Gretchen that having the MDBs make these labs on nature and investments is absolutely phenomenal. But the MDBs alone will not have the financial leverage to make that shift, right? It will take central banks, which is why your work, actually, Professor Mahjun, is so critical, because it has to do with some of the settings around it. Now, you asked me about development banks. Yes, I think, first of all, let's understand that there is no techno fix to this, to nature. It has to do with this long-termism, but we need to, for example, think, what are the drivers of biodiversity loss? Because we need to begin with the drivers. They are fragmentation and overexploitation, they're pollution, their invasive species, their climate change, and obviously an overexploitation, if I said that. So as long as we think of lateral expansion into nature, as long as that is a solution space for whatever it is, urban expansion, industrial expansion, infrastructure expansion, agriculture expansion, we will not bring about the solutions. Therefore, the kind of investments that we need to think about have to be much more holistic. Yes, we need the highway from point A to point B, but how are we designing that highway to, one, minimize, but that's no longer enough, to maximize and to have a better impact on nature? What is it that are we going to lift our highways up, or are we going to place them down? How are we going to densify our cities, thereby taking less land, or are we going to have more urban sprawl and gobble up agricultural land? These are the kind of levers that MDBs, yes, can impact on, but regulatory settings can impact on in a greater way. And of course, when we think about the kind of pollution effluents that we are having and the dead zones that our fertilizers are causing, what kind of agricultural systems can we invest in that minimize nitrogen runoff, that minimize these dead zones in our oceans and our rivers and waterways, that can minimize, therefore, impacts on nature? It is these kind of things that MDBs can lift and showcase. China has done brilliantly. I worked 15 years with the World Bank. They used the World Bank to test, because the World Bank was small in China compared to the Chinese Province, but they would test something with the World Bank money because it had a lower cost, right? And then they would take it to scale. These are the kind of things that every country that experiments in this space need to think about. The MDBs have a real opportunity here, finally. If we think about the way in which we consider nature, we also need to think about how we can integrate nature so that, as opposed to infrastructure, nature creates green infrastructure, whereas we have gray infrastructure with the hard stuff, right? We can design into our cities nature so that it can absorb the water when we have heavy floods or heavy rains, so that we replenish our water, our aquifers, or we can have it run off. We can have permeable pavements and streets, etc. But if we fail to do that because we are heading towards, the famous 10 billion population, and we think that lateral expansion is going to be the answer, we will find ourselves in this battle with nature, and we will find ourselves a sort of nature versus humanity, which obviously is not the way. This is why China's presidency of the COP15 that is coming up in December is so critical. We are negotiating global framework for biodiversity. It is a framework that will have legally implications at the national levels for parties to the convention. And it is a framework that will place clear targets that nations, in a manner similar to the Paris Accord, that nations will have signed up to and therefore have to adhere to. Let me stop here and hand it back to you. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Anderson. Let me ask our other panelists, see if you have any comments on the set of issues I raised and or anything else we have been just discussing. Yes, Frederick, please.
If I may just also add very quickly to what Mr. Anderson was saying, I think from the private sector and a commercial investor point of view, one of the things that would be particularly helpful would be some kind of a certainty and policy consistency over what gets recognized. Because I'll give you a practical example from my area of work right now. We are trying to invest into nature-based projects that would potentially yield carbon credits for corporates and institutions. Now, I think that in the near term, that's going to be an important part of how to stimulate the carbon markets and help people deal with some of their carbon footprint. The question for us really is that many of us may think about our net zero claims and our methodologies for claiming net zero as some uniform, homogeneous standard, that everybody has the same idea of what net zero actually means. The reality is that there are so many different market standards out there And depending on what logo you decide to put on your wall, how you actually claim net zero could be quite different. And what kind of carbon credit mechanisms, what kind of actual solutions and mitigation steps that you have to take could be very, very different. Now, the truth of it is that if there is no certainty as to what will get to be the defined standard or acceptable way of doing this, say post 2030, when the standards are likely to become a little bit more uniform, it would be a little bit of a concern for investors who are going to be putting money into nature projects that would have a longer life beyond 2030. So one of the things that I worry about is this Pluto problem, right? Because when we are all younger, we realize that we have X number of planets in our solar system. And then just some time ago, people decided to define Pluto out of being a planet. And Pluto is still circling around the sun, but it has just been defined out of being a planet. And what we are worried about is, will some of these things that we are investing in today become defined out of relevance for a net zero claim or for what corporates actually need? So maybe that is one area which I think if there was greater standard or at least some harmonization of definitions, and for governments and regulators to come up with some kind of policy consistency around how that will be defined for the longer term, it will certainly give a lot of comfort for investors like ourselves who will need to put significant amounts of money in for a longer term. Thank you.
Now, as you mentioned, standard, one thing I think is quite relevant is the standards for voluntary carbon markets. I noticed that Singapore has set up a voluntary carbon market recently, and Hong Kong is thinking about doing that. And I think many other places are about to launch their voluntary carbon markets. If each of them using different standard, it creates a lot of confusion and also maybe creating problem of greenwashing. So what's your view on that, Frederick?
Sorry, right. I think that definitely, there is a legitimate role for voluntary carbon markets in the near term to be able to help well-meaning corporates and institutions take a first step. It may not be perfect in the near term. And as you say, Dr. Ma, there would be different ideas around what would constitute a high quality carbon credit, for example. And different jurisdictions may accept different qualities, different standards. By the end of the day, I think we want to move towards setting common definitions around additionality, around the way that we actually account for it and measure the amount of carbon that's actually sequestered. But if I were to come back to what would make for a high credibility, high trust carbon market, at the end of the day, it begins first of all with robust science. Because if you do not have a proper science around nature, you really don't know whether the things that you're doing is really sequestering X amount of carbon or not, and what is the rate of that sequestration, and how do you even begin to price it. So you begin with the science, you got to have the facts. The second part of it is that you got to price appropriately. So in some of the reports, we realized that there are many countries around the world that would have very, very significant stores of natural capital, but without proper carbon pricing, right? And there will be no economic incentive for investors and pools of capital to come in to develop those projects. So therefore, it becomes a potential capability or potential capital, but not actually realizable ones in terms of real projects. And finally, I would imagine that there needs to be that confidence in the definitions of standards. Like, for example, even in say for diamonds, for example, there is a clear sense of how you actually measure the quality of a diamond, but there can be different quality levels and therefore different pricing associated with that. And it is really up to regulators to some extent and the industry coming together to define what is the appropriate cutoff to make something legitimate. Thank you.
Yeah, just follow on this standard topic. Maybe you aware that there's an effort going on between China and Europe to create the common ground taxonomy, which I'm proud in being a co-chair of this effort. And we spent 2 years under the IPSF working on the common ground taxonomy, which now has the second version published in June. And this is not specifically for nature and biodiversity, but for broader green and sustainability definition. So far, we have 72 activities in the common ground taxonomy that are recognized both by the European taxonomy and Chinese taxonomy. I think it's one of the first steps towards enhancing comparability and interoperability of global green standards. Now, let me ask Professor Daly and Professor Ouyang if you have any additional short remarks.
Sure, I would love to follow on some of the comments that you opened up with really, Professor Ma, and that Inger elaborated upon, and closing with what Mr. To just said. It's basically, in many years of work, actually together with Professor Ouyang, through the Natural Capital Project, a major partnership involving the MDBs, we see, number one, just huge scope for experimentation and innovation in the arenas that are so crucial here to achieve widely held standards and policy consistency, and also to achieve basically trust and confidence in these kinds of approaches, and open up new and ever more compelling demonstrations. So that's my main point. And then second, to achieve, sort of realize this opportunity, we can all realize that there's actually been a really inspiring track record by the MDBs over the past decade in making a very dramatic shift in the conceptualization of human development and the integration of nature, positive and climate neutral approaches. So just through our partnership, we've worked in over 60 countries directly. And just to touch on a couple of examples, through the Inter-American Development Bank, there's now a major program to secure water for cities in a way that is nature positive and very tuned to climate security. With over 55 major cities now involved in this, and other cities across the world following similar protocols. There's also a major effort demonstrated around coastal climate resilience, and that involves investing in coral reefs, mangroves, seagrass beds, and other habitats to protect people and property onshore and achieve many other types of benefits. Through the World Bank, there's been a lot of work on urban livability and sustainability, and many of other sort of national development plans along these lines. And then finally, the Asian Development Bank, also working on many dimensions here, has advanced gross ecosystem product as a way of integrating all of this and revealing in a metric that's parallel to GDP, gross domestic product, in construction, revealing basically the sum total value and benefits of nature to people. Second, guiding investments in countries from downstream beneficiaries of nature and secure climate to upstream rural communities that are stewarding nature. And third, tracking and rewarding progress. And these examples that have developed over the past decade, I think, provide a really powerful foundation. And I would close just emphasizing that what Frederick To, you're involved with, that's so exciting, is utterly crucial to integrate the nature and the climate approaches in a globally standardized type of way. And I'm excited to see where you head with all of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Ouyang, you'd like to say a few words? 欧阳老师，你再说几句。
行，对，刚才大家谈到，现在，目前的投入自然资本方面的，除了保护方面的，主要还是政府多一点，银行的积极不高，但是我们现在现实过程中也有问题，银行总是问一个问题，就是我保护生态，我投资自然资本，我的回报是什么？我的现金流是什么？现在现象我们都看到呢，目前碳市场的建立，就一定的现金流了，至少鼓励投资，投资指数造林，专家碳汇。但我们也看到自然资本的美学价值投入也是比较多的，像旅游啊、价值这些方面提升的。但是有很多生态产品和生态服务没有得到这些现金流很多的原因，还是经济政策的不完善。 相独立，生态系统能提供很多的水资源和水涵养，但是现在还没有把生态系统做水资源的这个创造的价值体现出来。所以现在没有一个企业来或者银行投资水涵养的生态保护地方。类似的还有生物多样性，还有土壤保持，还有气候调节，但是如果把这些能够资本为一个提供的服务能够经济竞争力体现出来，能要得到现金流，我估计会很多银行会介入。现在问题主要还是一些政策的资源、政策的不完善所造成的，所以对今后的发展可能这方面要进行突破。
谢谢欧阳教授。So that brings us to almost the close of the session. And before closing, let me give the floor to Mrs. Ging-Hui Niu, who is managing board member of the World Economic Forum. She will give us a few final remarks. Ging-Hui?
Thank you, Dr. Martin, for moderating this discussion. And thank you to our speakers, Inga, Gretchen, Zhiyun, and Fred, for sharing your perspectives on the opportunities to invest in nature and the challenges involved. And unlike other crises, the climate and environment crisis will not go away. In fact, I just read an article that says that we should not call this a crisis. We have to call it a collapse. Because unlike a financial or economic crisis, the environmental crisis and the potential damage to planet Earth and to ourselves will be irreversible if we are unable to respond in good time. And we need everyone to respond to this emergency and contribute to be a part of this solution. We need ambition, leadership, and partnership across all stakeholder groups. And here I want to thank the speakers because you're all leaders in your respective fields. In particular, finance and financial players have a very critical role to play in how we think and respond to the environmental challenges. I would like to take this opportunity to highlight 3 points which have been also flagged out by the speakers. First, the issues of climate, water, energy, biodiversity, food, and community are interconnected. And to address any of these challenges, we will need to adopt a holistic and systemic approach. And we cannot solve the issue of climate and carbon emissions if we do not address the issues of biodiversity and our larger ecosystem. Similarly, we will have to look at the jobs that depend on nature and our broader social and societal well-being if we want to achieve a smooth energy and food transition and continued economic development. In other words, financial investments in nature should be considered a form of wealth generation and preservation within the economy and society. And it is also a form of wealth transfer across generations. The second point I want to make is that even if we choose to look at nature-related investments in silo, and I think Fred highlighted this, as a standalone proposition, there is a strong business case to be made. Some of you might have read the report that we published earlier in January this year called Seizing Business Opportunities in China's Transition Towards a Nature-Positive Economy. And the study actually highlighted that 2/3 of China's total GDP is at risk of disruption from nature loss. And conversely, if we urgently make nature-positive transitions, we will be able to translate risks to opportunity. And in Chinese word, we call this 危机, how do you translate a risk into an opportunity? And these transitions cut across 3 socio-economic systems. 1, food, land, and ocean use. I think Madam Anderson highlighted this. Infrastructure and the built environment, as well as energy and extractives. And the report talks about how 15 transition pathways across all 3 systems, such as in the areas of regenerative agriculture, forest economy, environment and infrastructure design, as well as resource circularity, could add $1.9 trillion in annual business opportunities and close to 100 million jobs over the next 10 years. And this is just within China alone. Globally, a nature-positive economy can create $10 trillion of business opportunity and create nearly 400 million jobs by 2030. The third and the final point I want to make is, despite the fact that biodiversity loss and the collapse of ecosystems have been consistently rated as the top 3 global risks by business leaders, nature remains way underfunded. I think Mr. Oh Yang as well as Gretchen highlighted this. Current levels of investments in nature-based solutions equal only 0.1% of global GDP. And most of this funding are coming from the public sector. A recent report by the UNEP and the World Economic Forum released last year on the state of finance for nature found that there remains a $8.1 trillion financing gap to meet the world's climate change, biodiversity, and land degradation targets by 2050. And investments in nature-based solutions need to triple in real terms. And if we want to achieve our targets, I think Dr. Ma eloquently put it to say, look, we need to talk about addressing risks. We need to think about mobilizing more private capital. And public finance alone will not fill this gap. And echoing the theme of this event, unlocking the power of nature financing, we need to mobilize more capital and explore new market mechanisms and policy levers. I think the panel has spoken about some of these areas. And at the forum, we are working on the solution space with various stakeholders, including financial institutions and development banks, to raise ambition, unlock obstacles, and catalyze the marketplace. Matching philanthropic public capital with private finance. This will allow a lot more scale and leverage. I close here. We're slightly overrun on time, and I would like to thank all of you for your participation in this session. And I hope that you will participate actively in the various programs by the forum to help us scale finance and finance capital for nature. Back to you, Martin. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Geng Hui, for the excellent summary. I won't repeat these takeaways, but just add a few words on how to mobilize private sector financing from a perspective of central banks and supervisors. Some of these views were actually covered in the NGFS Inspire report recently. I think one thing we need to do is to develop a taxonomy on nature positive activities. Some of the markets have similar taxonomy already, but most markets don't have a taxonomy. Once you have a taxonomy that includes the list of specified nature positive projects, I think then incentives can be put in to encourage private sector participation and also to prevent greenwashing in related investments. The second thing is to put in incentive. Incentive could be in the form of low-cost funding. For example, in China, the central bank has used what they call decarbonization facility to encourage low-carbon projects by providing low-cost funding. And we can think about similar approach of providing low-cost funding either through government subsidy or through central bank facility to enhance the profitability of private sector investment in these projects. And thirdly, it's a disclosure. That's a work done by TNFD, which is very important. I think going forward, many of these recommendations should go into government and regulatory requirements, asking financial institutions, including banks, to evaluate the impact of the investment activities on biodiversity and nature and disclose such implications so that through the public scrutiny, they could be encouraged to take on more positive, nature positive projects rather than nature negative projects. And the final point is really innovation on products. We need many, many different products, whether they're loans or bonds or equity investment instruments, so that we can meet the very diverse demands from the nature-related space. And some of the products should have long enough duration to be consistent with the project duration going forward. So in the interest of time, I think we need to really close this session. And let me once again thank all the panelists for the great contribution and insights, and thank audience on watching live stream. And of course, big thanks to World Economic Forum for hosting this very important discussion. Thank you. Thank you very much again. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Greetings. Bye.
Bye.